Hi, folks. You're Tacitus today. Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the similarity today, the similarity with the third world peasants coming into the West today and their view of gimme, 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 we want, hand it all out, hand it over, and their attitude of communal ownership. They come from, remember, most of them come from these dirt poor peasant, dirt floor, mud hut type places, and they come to the West and they look around and they, wow, you have so much, you've got so much. Why won't you share it with us? And they seem to have two sort of attitudes to this. One is the reason you have so much is because you stole it all. That's why you have so much. Therefore, it is what you have is illegitimately owned, and we should just take it because you took it in the first place. And the second view that they have is that you have so much because you didn't share it as we would. You know, we in our little communal villages out in the middle of fucking nowhere in some third world shithole, we share everything we have. Everything is shared with the village. So if someone has a bit more than we think they should, it means that they didn't share it as willingly as they're kind of required to do in our folklore type situation. And so this is the same for you guys here, you white Western people. You've got so much, that means you didn't share it like you should. Now, even middle-class Indians and Pakistanis, or the subcontinent generally, even ones that I would say would be, in theory at least, if you looked at an equivalent sort of person in the West, they would be, the Western person would be far more sophisticated in their understanding of the world and how it works. But these, again, middle-class Indians, they said, well, there must be something wrong. The wealth of the West should be shared around equally with us. You should share it with us. So it's equal. We should be equal in the wealth we have. And because the West has more, it means you must have done something bad to get it. You stole it, didn't share it, whatever, cheated other people. So they have these very different views. Now we can look at these views and say, well, how would they think this way and see the world this way? But actually, it's been around for a long time. They've been exposed to Western views and attitudes and commerce and technology for close on 500 years, or it began at least 500 years ago. The spread wasn't even, and moved in fits and starts. But once the Portuguese in particular and the Iberians generally, and also the Italian city-state, trading city-states, got going with their long ocean-going vessels, then that changed the entire map of the world in terms of trading and commerce. Long ocean-going vessels hadn't hitherto existed. So there were there were short seasons of the year when the winds were blowing in the right direction. There were, favorable currents and these sorts of things where, say if you went from Northern Europe, around Norway, then you went to Greenland, this is going, and then you went across the top there. You could get to eastern Canada or the islands off there and then start moving down the coast. But ships used to have to be, really, you had to be inside of a coast and or a very short season of travel. But the long ocean going vessels meant you could travel for much longer times of the year and could travel vast distances, and you could be outside or away from land, and you had the technology, the navigational instruments to be able to do that. Now, as the technology developed, then commerce quickly followed when the ships that were built were able to carry cargoes of goods for trade, in effect, spices from the east and all sorts of things like that. And this is something hitherto, the ships you could move some people around, a few bits and pieces, but it had to be a quick journey. But now all that changed. So Europeans, for the first time, were coming in broad contact with many different societies and particularly hunter-gatherer societies. Now, we'll say the French trading post in what today we would call Quebec, that's an example of it. So the early French traders, or the Dutch traders that were in what today we would call New York, it used to be, I think, New Amsterdam, the Dutch called it. They had a trading post there. Modern day Wall Street was the defensive wall they had built around the Dutch settlement there. So anyway, this is the the Europeans were in contact with all these hunter-gatherer societies, and of course they wrote notes and made comments, wrote up journals on what they observed and what they saw. And it's not loaded in any way with ideology or anything like that. They just recorded what they saw, and what's remarkable is how similar their assessment of those people back in the 1600s, how similar it is to the attitudes of the third world people coming into the West today. So say the French fur traders and all that sort of thing back in, say, the early 1600s as an example. They marveled at the hunter-gatherer attitude of the Indian tribes there in and around that Quebec area, and how the tribes would share everything. They were just nomadic hunter-gatherers. They kept, other than the clothes they had and some immediate tools or a bow and arrow, they didn't keep anything or store anything. They had the most hand-to-mouth, subsistence hunter-gatherers. They had the most hand-to-mouth view of day-to-day existence, and also sharing. So their concept of sharing was recorded by these early French traders and even the early French missionaries. And the French viewed this as a moral failing. The fact you're not providing for winter, you're not storing food, you're not growing crops, you're not having animals, this idea of you're not sort of preparing for things. They perceived this as a moral failing among the Indians, and that if they were given a good Christian education and were converted to the ways of the Lord, that they would in turn mend their ways and behave sensibly. It never happened, and they couldn't. The Europeans just couldn't get their head around why do these people live like this? Given how many of them would die in winter and all these sorts of things. So the nub of it came with the Europeans trying to point out to the Indians the folly of using something up voraciously until it was all gone. So the Indians, again, they lived subsistence, hand to mouth and all this sort of stuff, but they'd come into a white settlement and they'd look at all the food that was stored in the grain, for example, that was stored in all the smoked salted meat that was being put aside for the winter, and they would look at all these things and they would say, back in the time, you have so much. Look at all the things you have. Well, why won't you share that with us? And the Indians would go out and catch a rabbit, for example, or kill a rabbit, bring it in and say, well, I've given you the rabbit. Now you have to give me 100 tons of smoked meat or something in exchange. We're sharing what we have. You have more, we have less. Therefore, you should share what you have with us. So the outcomes are equal. And this was, or more or less equal. So it's a very communal sense of sharing. So we give you one little bit, but you give us a lot in return. Why should you give us a lot in return? Because you have more. You have more than we do, and you should thus share it. So this was the attitude of the Indians, and they would constantly pester and demand, and ask for more and more and more. And initially, in order to keep good relations and to get on side, initially the European traders would concede, okay, well, you can have a bit more, then you can have some more meat or grain or whatever it was that was, being asked for. And then they realised that the Indians would never stop asking. The Indians would only stop asking when there was nothing left to take. And this was something that again these early traders, European traders, realised. So they had to say, no, you can't have this. If you behave as we do, then you too can have these things, as in, the food surpluses and things like that. For example, the Europeans would build, sturdy huts and buildings. Whereas the Indians wouldn't. They would have these mobile, tents, the wigwams and that sort of thing. So this whole idea of how to live and how to conserve and how to maintain, other things that used to frustrate the Europeans, they would give, say, axes or knives or steel products, iron products to the Indians who had never seen this sort of thing before. Remember, they're Stone Age people, so they marvel at this sort of stuff. And but as soon as the blade became blunt, they would discard the item. They just throw it away. It's no use anymore. So the Europeans would try and show them, well, look, by using a sharpening stone, you can return the blade to a state of sharpness, so you can use it for hunting or skinning or whatever. And but they wouldn't bother with that. They just lose the sharpening stone, or why should I carry that? It's not of immediate use to me right now. And this was very much something that the Europeans again marveled at, that these people lived, the Stone Age nomadic people lived in the moment, but still maintained this communal sense of you should share it with us. And again, they would give him a rabbit and would expect multiple tons of salted beef in return. But we only have one rabbit to give you, but you have tons of beef. Why won't you give us the tons of beef? And they couldn't really shake the Indians out of this mentality. Now, this is the same mentality as you see today. If you look at the masses of people coming from Africa, coming from the Indian subcontinent, and even sort of lower ranking countries, like Albania or Bulgaria or somewhere like that, coming to the first world, they have more or less this same attitude of, but you have so much, why won't you share it with us? You should share it with us. It's wrong not to share it with us. If you don't share it with us, we'll take it. And in the area of welfare, food stamps or whatever other welfare services are being offered, these people see they're absolutely entitled to it because you're sharing the bounty of the vast riches that you have. So when they come from all their dirt poor places and their mud huts and their totally dysfunctional societies where you walk over dead bodies in the street, and they come to the very orderly places in Western Europe or North America with the tall buildings and the public services that function vastly better than anything in their place where they've come from, then they just assume this is an embodiment of the riches that must be shared with them, and they become entitled. We see it as entitled, but they just see it as you're just sharing what you have because you have a lot to share, and it should be shared equally. So we all have a approximately equal amount, which is how they live in their own villages. What sort of I find striking is that after hundreds of years of living in the white man's orderly world, or at least being exposed to the orderly world of the technology and again the administration and the organization and the development and the maintenance of resources and so on, that they still are living with the same attitudes, almost exactly the same. I mean, close to word for word, exactly the same attitudes that the early European traders encountered, whether they were in North America or even if they're in India. The Indians had that same attitude then that the traders noted, which, by the way, they still have today. It was only recently I was talking to an Indian I would assume was a middle class guy. He certainly had a lot of the and again he said, well, the white people have too much money, too much wealth. It should be shared around evenly with us, the Indians, and it should be more even than it is, and the outcome should be more or less even, so that every Indian has approximately the same amount of wealth as every white person. But India is a misrun, mismanaged basket case compared to any white Western country, and yet the Indian seems to think that there should be equal outcomes. Why? Because it should be shared in their view, and this is something that they haven't lost. Now, of course, you can find exceptions. Someone like in the United States, Dinesh D'Souza obviously understands the difference there, but the majority, and I would say well over 95%, don't or refuse to, either one. But they're not prepared to create the wealth themselves and take the steps and the discipline necessary to create that wealth. Only Western people can do that, have that discipline and organizational structure and sense of purpose and focus and technology, and so only white Western people have it. And in spite of the Africans being exposed for hundreds of years to white Western technology and organizational structure, look at Zimbabwe and South Africa. Look how quickly the black population just pillaged what was there, living in the moment, living in the day, which was exactly how they were first described by the first white people arriving. Their behavior is almost exactly the same. It hasn't changed. What is necessary to change that behavior on a sufficient scale with sufficient durability that would make a difference? I don't even know if it's possible. Being a Tacitus Today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.